members of general public and media, secretariat team, dear viewers, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure again to join you guys on this live telecast of our second submission today on cyber crime bill. And it's a pleasure to welcome each and every one of you who are joining us live today. Thank you very much for that. As mentioned in today's earlier submission, this submission will also be made available to public through media and television through our Parliament channel on our VLSC platform. Therefore, kindly advising that any sensitive information that cannot be disclosed in front of public, it can be given to this committee either in private or in writing. This parliamentary inquiry and all information gathered is covered under the Parliamentary Powers and Privileges Act. In terms of the protocol of this committee hearing, kindly requesting that there be a minimal use of mobile phone, and all mobile phones are to be on silent mode while this meeting is in progress. I'd like to take this time to actually introduce my team members who are present here for this virtual meeting and public submission. Myself, I'm Honorable Elvik Marhas, Chairperson on Justice, Law and Human Rights. And I'll request Honorable Rohit Sharma if he can actually introduce himself, please.
Chair, and I would like to welcome all the viewers again. And I am Honorable Sharma, Justice, Law and Human Rights Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Sharma. I'll request Honorable Dr. Salik Govind if he can actually introduce himself, please.
Yeah, Honorable Chair, members of Secretariat, invited guests. Good morning. I am Dr. Salik Govind. I am a member of the Justice, Law and Human Rights Committee.
Thank you, Honorable Govind, for introducing yourself. And today the committee will be hearing submissions on Cybercrime Bill 2020, Bill number 11 of 2020. And joining the committee today is Ms. Salineta. I now invite Ms. Salineta to provide her submission, and please note that if there are any questions by the members, we may intervene or interject in between, or if not, then we'll actually leave all the question and answer session at the end of the submission. Thank you, ma'am. You have the floor now. Vinaka.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. My name is Tamanikaiwaimaro. You can call me Sala or Nieta. And I thank you for the opportunity to comment on the Cyber Bill draft number 11 of 2020. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate the committee in inviting the general public to comment on the bill in its current form. And I consider it a privilege to be able to comment and also to address you today. In terms of the submissions, I'd sent written submissions, but I'd just like to canvass a few pertinent things that I feel the committee could look at. Firstly, I'm glad to see the cybercrime bill underfoot. It's critical because the current legislation clearly is not able to penalize various offenses because there are gaps. And I'd just like to say that traditionally, when cybercrime takes place online, and there are two overarching areas of cybercrime, one being the cyber dependent, which can only be committed through the use of online devices, and the other, or where the devices are the tool. The other one is cyber enabled, like traditional crimes, which can be increased by in scale by using computers. I've also submitted a paper that I wrote in 2010 called Cybersecurity in the Republic of Fiji, where on pages 13 and 14, I made a comparative analysis of various jurisdictions' cybercrime offenses. You'll see that on pages 13 and 14, you'll see Australia, US, EU. So when you see the way the current bill is currently worded, it sort of mirrors the European categorization. But as you can imagine, when I did that categorization, that was way back in 2010. So 10 years onwards, you'll still see the gaps that were highlighted in the table. And what I've done is I've updated it to factor in the Online Safety Act and also UK's categorization. I will say that the Online Safety Act is primarily based on a subset of content-related offences, which typically fall within cybercrime. And so you will see in the submissions I sent you, if you could refer to the annexure, it'll show the different categorizations, but we'll come to that later on. Suffice to say is that the table is there for your technical purview, and it will show you the offences that have yet to be inserted into the draft. And those are the ones that are left blank in the last column in the table. For now, I'd like to comment on the interpretation provision in terms of authorized person. I would say that it should include the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution and the Online Safety Commission, and in the future where bodies created specifically to deal with this, I would widen this from police officer to law enforcement officer. The reason why I say this is because the cybercrime unit sits within the Fiji police force, and so traditionally it's the DPP that prosecutes the cybercrime offences in Fiji. At the moment, it's computer-related offences. In terms of the interpretation of minister, because the police falls within is part of the discipline services of Fiji, I would submit that the interpretation should read that minister should be Minister for Defence, as policing is a law enforcement issue. The Ministry of Communication, I'd respectfully submit, is responsible for setting policies and regulating telecommunications and licensing internet service providers and telcos. And having said that, obviously, in terms of the telecommunications regulations, those are enforced by TEF, which is a telecommunications authority. But in terms of the cybercrime offences, it's traditionally and jurisdictionally been the remit of the Fiji Police Force. But what I've done is obviously there's cooperation and collaboration amongst diverse agencies, as is with all things. So to show this relationship, I refer to paragraph 11 of my written submissions, where you'll see I did a jurisdictional map. You see these circles, colored circles, paragraph 11. Can you see?
Yes, yeah.
So what I've done, that image was done way back in 2010. So obviously I could update it, but traditionally those agencies still are the same agencies. So I would submit that FICAC's remit is, corruption offences, whereas in terms of prosecution of corruption offences, and the DPP has a wider scope. But in terms of law enforcement, I would submit that as is currently, it's within the Fiji police force. And obviously you'll see the overlapping jurisdiction between the police, working in collaboration with the different ministries, the different agencies. So I've showed both the domestic, national, and regional. The other interpretation I'd refer to is the term serious offense. So damages caused by certain cybercrime can amount to millions of dollars in damages. When we did 5 years worth of national consultations, some of the damages was massive. And it went way beyond 500. For instance, when certain people who were abroad sort of invaded because of confidentiality, like a private institution, but the cost was hundreds and thousands. And obviously that institution's insurance, overseas insurance, covered the loss, but to penalize and say 506 months, for serious offense. So there has to be a reasonable tariff in terms of a reasonable spectrum, minimum and max. The other thing I would like to submit is there needs to be a distinction between summary offenses, either way offenses, and indictable offenses. In terms of the definition of service provider, so the way the bill is currently drafted, it's just limited to offenses that are restricted within computers. But I would submit that because you've got things like theft of telecommunication services, that it should be broadened. The service provider should be expanded to say an entity that provides access to the physical layer or transportation layer, application layer of the internet. So in other words, what I'm talking about is the cyber environment, and there has to be a definition of what a cyber environment is. Because if people are prosecuting, we'll have to be specific, because there's certain offenses that can happen where you don't need a computer. You don't need a computer or device to pull off the crime. I remember having to go to Christchurch to investigate numbering theft and that sort of thing. So it's quite diverse, whether it's spectrum, whether it's interference along the fiber cables. Like take for instance, a private company is doing surveillance along the fiber cable. And so because of that, I would submit that there has to be a definition of a cyber environment and a wider definition of service provider. And so for the committee's ease, I've defined it in paragraph 13 of my submission. And I've also put an illustration, which is actually from page 35 of Jovan Kurpelige's book, Internet Governance. So it's got the infrastructure, which is the physical layer at the bottom, which includes the submarine fiber cables, the telecommunication towers. It includes the transport layer, which is the protocols, whether it's the computer networks, and it includes content and application. And content and application is what I referred to earlier, where the Online Safety Act covers some of it, but the others that are not covered by it should be covered within the cybercrime bill. Because the content and applications can include things like ATM machines, computers. So if we're just creating law or creating defining the cyber environment as limited to one layer, we'll become limited, and so it'll be hard to prove the other offenses. Okay.
Ma'am, sorry to interject. Yes, I think from one of our submissions, we received from one of our submittees that they were actually proposing that the service provider definition should be narrowed to the service provider only. And you are actually saying over here it should be broadened to cover everyone. And I think that was the interpretation at that point in time, that the current definition of service provider actually covers all these things like ATM machines and all those that actually deal with it. Yeah.
I would respectfully submit that if it's not defined within it's not defined within the bill, people can get away with it easily. Like, and so the three layers that I'm showing here, physical layer, transport layer, application layer, those are the cyber environment. And so when we say service provider, we can say, okay, which service provider is it? Are we talking about the internet service provider, or are we, or and so just that level of specificity.
Okay.
And feel free that at any point further to the deliberations, if there are any requests for clarification, happy to come on again.
Yes, ma'am.
And it's important to note that in order to adequately prosecute theft of telecommunication services, espionage in submarine cables. So for example, let me give an example. There are countries in the Pacific or territories where the US government completely forbids certain vendors from coming into the site to install routers, and those routers are not even computers. And the reason for it is it has the capacity to resend and recapture information, like to mirror the information for surveillance purposes. So for that reason, whether it's the UK, whether it's NATO here in Europe, whether it's the Americans in American territories, you will see that they forbid certain companies. Usually it would be the Chinese companies. Not that I have anything against China. I love the Chinese people. I went to a Chinese school. But what I'm saying is that there's a need to broaden the definition of a cyber environment from just a computer. Because if you're not specific, it's very easy to defend the charge. Does it make sense?
It does.
Okay. And so let's move on. So, because a lot of my submissions are written already, it's easy for you, but I'm just picking up what I feel is critical. Are there any questions for me at this point before I move on to the next bit?
Members, do you have any questions?
So far, all good.
Honorable Govind?
Yeah, okay with me. Thank you.
Okay. We can continue, madam.
Okay, let's continue. So the other thing I noticed with the bill, the way it's currently drafted, it's limited to Fiji citizens in Fijian jurisdiction. I would go further to submit that majority of the offending is actually taking place where the victims are actually Fiji citizens. It's taking place within the Fiji cyber, obviously the cyber environment, but they're not necessarily Fiji citizens, like the perpetrators.
Yeah.
Whether it's the ones who are creating the malware.
You mean to say somebody sitting somewhere else and committing this crime in Fiji?
Absolutely. And for that reason, I would submit that Section 3 in terms of application should be broadened to capture them. And so I've mentioned it in paragraph 15 of my submission. And I've also referred you to a country which is one of the leading, the world considers one of the leading super connected world, who are very stringent on cyber attacks and cyber defense. In fact, the Americans are mentored by the Estonians, I would say. Or at least when His Excellency, the former President of the United States, Barack Obama was in office, Estonia was the official advisor for the US. And so you notice that the link that I've mentioned, a presentation made by the Estonian government, where they had, in the link that I've sent, which is hyperlinked into the submission, they personally had experienced weaknesses in cases in terms of prosecution because they felt that the law was not specific enough, or it wasn't adequate, or the penalty and certainly wasn't serious enough. It certainly didn't match the offenses. Now, this paragraph 16 of my submission, I go to what I referred to initially in terms of the categorization. I apologize, it might be a bit dry, but it's the annexure. Can just edit, let me know if you can see it.
This is the first one. You are talking about the table.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
The annexure table showing categories of cybercrime by jurisdiction. What I've done is I've compared it to Fiji's categorizations in terms of existing domestic law, and then I've also analyzed it with the cybercrime bill. And so the places where you see domestic laws, where it's filled, where it's blank, and then you'll see at the cybercrime bill where it's blank. Can you see? So those are things. Those are things that are sort of missing from the bill.
So you mean to say, like, for example, number 2, computer-related traditional crimes?
Yes. So, for example, number 2, computer-related traditional crimes.
Yes.
You can see it in the Crimes Decree, Section 340 and 346.
Right.
For example, like fraud. Fraud happens, it's a traditional crime, but if it happens online, that would be perceived as a computer-related traditional crime. So in terms of content-related offenses, I mentioned that content is a very big umbrella. A subset of that content is actually mentioned in Section 24 and 25 of the Online Safety Act, particularly in relation to what the Indian Indian legislation in India, they refer to as ragging, or we refer to as bullying or harassment online or trolling.
Yeah.
But there are other aspects of content that could be covered. And so this is EU cybercrime, infringement of privacy. We don't really have appropriate offenses in relation to that. Like, for instance, let me give an example. The computer that you have in front of you, the fact that we are using this platform to talk to each other, you can see me and I can see you, right?
Yeah.
When our computer is switched off, somebody, because we are connected, we're globally connected, once we're on the net, anyone can hijack your camera and spy on you and watch you. So even when your computer is switched off, so you can be butt naked, moving around or doing whatever in your home, and somebody can violate your privacy by coming into your bedroom through your machine. Does this make sense?
Yep, it does.
That is not yet in the cybercrime bill. So that's why there's a blank there. So whenever you see a blank, so I'm going according to categorizations and comparing different jurisdictions. Then obviously you've got the Australian category. So the Australians, they've got different categories. Before I go to the Australian category, I just want to say, different countries, you'll see they have these different categories. The reason for that is, just like my dress won't fit Sushila in Fiji, because they also have other laws that run in tandem that may address certain things. So to just rely on the European categorization, we would err if we did not do the comparison. So this is already done, so it'll make your work easy. Just for you to consider. So going to the Australian, for instance, you've got theft of telecommunication services. So this has never been covered in Fiji. So it's good to see that it's going to be covered under Section 12 of the bill. And you've got things like communications in furtherance of criminal conspiracies. We don't have that. Telecommunications piracy. While we have some aspect of it in the copyright decree, we don't really have that. And it doesn't have to be called the telecommunications, just piracy alone, but so dissemination of offensive material, obviously that's covered in the Online Safety Act. Money laundering is already covered. The other thing that's not covered is electronic vandalism, terrorism, and extortion. Terrorism is covered in the Crimes Act. If I were to give you an example of electronic vandalism, if, say, for example, Mr. Jones from Tonga hijacked the Parliament website and you had private content which the speaker or the MPs would be accessing your own private database, and you were unable to access it because all you would see are swear words and graffiti, or like your leader in diapers, or an MP, with a bottle of milk, like to make fun, just like how you do vandalize a building.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the same thing in terms of, and believe it or not, it's actually happened to the government websites in the past. But not to that extent where they put illustration, but they certainly deface the website. But it's not something that people like to really talk about because people like to pride themselves on security. So as you can see, when you go through the table, there's quite a long list. You've got the US categorization, trafficking in passwords is not an offense in our bill. Can you see?
Yes.
And it's for the standing committee from the parliament to go back and see, okay, which ones do we want to canvass? But as is currently, I would say you need to include to be robust, because there's no point in coming back and forth in amending later when you can get it right now. So one of the things that I've added for your ease of reference, there were two documents that I sent, as I mentioned. One is my submission. The other one is the paper I wrote in 2010, which provides an overview for anyone who may not necessarily understand the connections. It would just make it easy reading, very, very light and easy reading. So another thing that's not covered is distributed denial of service attacks. Dark web, where the hackers go. The other stuff is covered, like identity theft is covered under Section 11 of the bill. The from 5 to 11 is covered under Online Safety Act. And that's what I was referring to, the subspecies. Now, in terms of UK's 13 categorization, I would submit that we don't need to codify that, because we have villages who don't have proper libraries in the outer islands and rural areas, and they rely on the internet, they rely on secondhand information, and that sort of thing, virtual information, online content. And you would obviously be receiving so many submissions, and there'd be people talking to you about sentencing and tariffs and the legal aspects, and that's why I didn't want to go too much into it, because I know they're going to do it. But what I would like to say is, for first offenders, particularly kids, we have up and coming kids who are bright and innovative, like 14 years old or 12 years old. They're learning to manipulate protocol and code. And so if they were to be caught in certain things, just the redemptive and rehabilitative aspect to channel that innovation, and so that they're not grossly penalized, if that makes sense, because they have a whole future ahead of them. And so, like channeling that capacity to innovate, because I understand that Fiji has a digital strategy, and so part of it is growing a broader human capacity. And essentially, those are the gist of my submissions. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you, Madam, for that in-depth deliberation with regards to the cybercrime bill itself. This graph that you have actually, the table that you have provided gives a very good insight, and definitely will be going back to our drafters to get their views as to how these ones can be incorporated, or if there was any reasons for this kind of things to be left out from this particular bill, or if it is covered somewhere else. Yes. that might be one of the reasons that's why it's not covered over here. But it provides a very good overview for the committee to actually look into these things that are not actually covered. And the points you have actually mentioned are well taken on board. I'll open the floor now for other members if they have anything they want to bring up or get any clarification with regards to the bill.
Yes, I would also like to thank the presenter for a very comprehensive presentation. A lot of new areas have been highlighted, and definitely we will deliberate at committee level. And if it's not incorporated, if reasons to incorporate, we'll incorporate in the bill. So that's all I have, and I'd like to thank the presenter again.
Thank you, Honorable Salik. Honorable Sharma.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank Madam Sala for your timely submission. And Madam, definitely we will come back to you as we meet in-house for a meeting, and we will just collaborate all the submissions you have provided from your side, and we will have some queries or some questions when we'll see the soft copy and the hard copy of it. It's in front of us. Then definitely we will come back to you if we have any questions or any anything or information we need from you. Otherwise, thank you very much, Madam.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And once again, on behalf of the committee, Madam, thank you very much for valuing yourself to do this presentation. As alluded to earlier, a very insightful submission from you. Thanks a lot for taking out your time. And now we shall have a final comments from you before we actually close this submission. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. One of my final comment is the issue of jurisdiction, which I canvass in the submissions, in terms of who is going to be enforcing it. Who is going to be enforcing it? That's something I leave to you and the relevant ministry and the drafters and the drafting instructions. Because when drafters draft, they have to receive drafting instructions from the relevant line ministry. So for instance, cybercrime, if I remember correctly, there was a cabinet directive back in 2011. Way back then, they had wanted a cybercrime legislation, and so that's just something for you to consider. But other than that, I would like to thank you, sir, and thank you, honorable members of the committee, for allowing me the opportunity to address you today.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, viewers. We shall take a 10 minutes break now before we actually go into our third submission. Thank you. Vinagavakalevu.